The sky turned the color of iron ore about an hour before the snow began, and Cassia Voss read it correctly from the seat of her wagon and knew she was not going to make it back to Ridgecrest before it broke. She had been on the road since first light, returning from the Tenney homestead 6 miles east, where she had stayed 2 nights, helping young Bertha Tenney through a labor that had taken longer than expected and ended, finally, with a healthy boy. That was the work. Long, unhurried, and sometimes frightening, and then suddenly done. And the world had one more person in it than it had before. Cassia had packed her bag, kissed the baby's forehead, drunk 1 cup of coffee she did not deserve, and started for home. She was a traveling midwife, had been for 3 years working a route that looped through 7 townships across 2 counties in the Wyoming Territory, carrying a worn leather satchel that held her instruments, her linens, her tinctures, and a small journal where she recorded every birth in her careful hand. She had no permanent house of her own. She rented a room in Ridgecrest when she was in town, and slept in farmhouse guest rooms and the back rooms of churches when she was not. This was the shape of the life she had chosen, and she had chosen it plainly, with both eyes open, because the work suited her, and the road did not frighten her, and there was always a woman somewhere who needed her. But she had not accounted for the sky turning that particular shade of iron. She pulled her wagon to the verge of the track and sat for a moment looking at the clouds piling up from the northwest, dark and thick and moving fast. The cold that came ahead of them was not ordinary December cold. It had a weight to it, a pressure, the kind of cold that gets into the wagon boards and the horse's breath and your own chest all at once. Her mare, Josephine, shifted and snorted and showed her opinion of the situation without being asked. The Callaway Ranch was less than a mile north. She had passed its gate twice before on her circuit and had never stopped, but she had delivered a baby there 4 years ago when she was new to the territory, the wife of the previous owner, and she remembered the house well enough. There was supposed to be a new man there. Now people in Ridgecrest spoke of him the way they spoke of things they were still making up their minds about. A widower bought the Callaway, spread 2 springs past, kept mostly to himself. His cattle were in good condition, and his fences were maintained, and beyond that nobody seemed to know much about him. The first flake hit her cheek. She turned Josephine north. The gate was exactly where she remembered it, weathered wood and a crossbeam with a name burned into it that had faded to near nothing, a single large letter G, and below it the brand shape of a bent star. The lane beyond was a 1/4 mile of frozen ground running straight toward a low-slung ranch house with smoke pulling steadily from its chimney, 2 outbuildings, a barn with its doors shut against the coming weather, and a rail fence enclosing a near-empty paddock. 1 horse stood at the fence watching her come, a big, gray, deep-chested, with the patient look of a horse that had seen weather before and had its opinions about that, too. She made it to the yard just as the sky let go. Not a gentle beginning. No warning, flurries, or polite precursor. One moment there were individual flakes, and the next there was a wall of white moving in from the northwest so fast that by the time she pulled Josephine up to the barn, she could not see the fence line she had just driven through. The wind came behind the snow like something unleashed, driving the flakes horizontal, prying at her coat, finding every gap she had. She was getting Josephine out of the traces and into the shelter of the barn's overhang when the ranch house door opened and a man came out without a coat, walking fast toward her. He was tall and broad through the shoulder in a way that came from work rather than size. Mid-30s or perhaps older. It was difficult to say in poor light and driving snow. Dark hair cut short and a jaw that had not been shaved in a few days, and eyes that looked at her, and then at Josephine, and at the sky, all in one quick assessment. "Get the horse inside," he said, pulling the barn door open without ceremony. "Get yourself inside after." There was no warmth in it, and no coldness either. It was the voice of a man who saw a practical problem and was solving it. She did not argue. She led Josephine inside. The man took the horse from her with practiced hands and walked her to a stall already bedded, and Cassia stood in the relative shelter of the barn and caught her breath and felt the cold she had been out running finally close in around her. "Garrick Hale," the man said from the stall, not looking up from where he was checking Josephine's feet. "Cassia Voss, traveling midwife out of Ridgecrest." She paused. "I'm sorry to impose. I was trying to make it home from the Tenney place." He came out of the stall and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were grey-green, the color of sage in low light, and they held the kind of steadiness that comes not from ease, but from long practice. He looked at the wall of white beyond the barn door. "You won't make it to Ridgecrest tonight," he said. "Not in this." A pause. "Or tomorrow, by the look of it." "No," she agreed. "House is warm. Come on." That was the whole of the invitation. The ranch house was not large, but it was solid. Thick log walls that held the heat the way good construction does, a floor that had been swept recently, a main room with a plank table, and 4 chairs and a cast-iron stove working hard against the cold. There was a kitchen that led off the back, a bedroom visible through one door, and a narrow room visible through another, that she would later learn Garrick used as an office of sorts, a ledger desk, a rifle on the wall, the kind of room where a man did the solitary accounting of a life run alone. He put a pot on the stove without asking her if she was hungry, because it was supper time, and she was plainly a traveler who had been cold for hours. And feeding people in that situation was not a question. She set her satchel down and took off her coat, and hung it on the peg near the door, and looked at the room in the unhurried way she looked at everything, taking inventory, finding the shape of the life that lived here. There were no feminine touches, but the room was not neglected. Things were in their places. The woodpile beside the stove was stacked with care. On the shelf above the kitchen window there was a single photograph in a small frame, turned at an angle that made it visible from the table but not from the door, as though he had thought about where to put it with some deliberateness. She did not look at the photograph. It was not her business. He set a bowl in front of her, venison stew, thick with root vegetables, the kind of thing that had been simmering since midday. It was very good, better than she had expected, and she said so without putting any particular emphasis on the surprise, because she was a practical woman and did not think feeding oneself well was remarkable. "You do this alone?" she asked. She meant the ranch. "The stew." "All of it." 3 years, he said. She ate, and he ate, and the wind made a sound against the shutters that was somewhere between a moan and a roar, a long shapeless note that filled the gaps between their words and made the quiet between them less uncomfortable than it might have been. There is something about a serious storm that makes strangers into temporary allies. The weather is the shared problem, and that takes the edge off the awkwardness. "How bad will it be?" she asked. He considered it honestly. "Bad enough," he said. "I've seen this kind before. They don't always pass quick. You should plan for a few days." She nodded. She had a berth 2 weeks out in Whitmore, which was to the south, but 2 weeks was 2 weeks, and there was nothing to do about the weather. She had been in worse situations. She had delivered a baby in a tent during a summer hailstorm. She had spent 4 days storm-bound in a mountain shepherd's cabin with a family of 6. The winter before last she had slept 3 nights in her wagon on the near side of a flooded creek because she could not cross it. You learned in this work to sit inside the situation you were actually in rather than the one you had planned. "I won't be in your way," she said. He looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was also not particularly self-conscious. "I didn't say you would be," he said, and that was that. He gave her the bedroom and took the narrow room for himself, and she did not argue about it because the wind outside had grown strong enough now to push under the door, and the bedroom had a small iron stove of its own that he lit before he left her to it. She lay in the dark listening to the storm and thought about Bertha Tenney's baby and the weight of him in her arms, that specific gravity that all newborns have, neither light nor heavy, but entirely themselves. She was up before him, which seemed to surprise him, though he recovered quickly. She had found the larder, which was well stocked. A man who spent winters alone on a Wyoming ranch, learned to provision correctly, and had put water on for coffee, and was examining what he had when he came through the kitchen doorway. He stopped and looked at her, at the stove, and said nothing for a moment. "I do not sit still well," she said, by way of explanation, "and I pay my way. I'm a decent cook." "All right," he said. Through the kitchen window the world was entirely white, and the wind was still strong enough that the snow came sideways more often than down. Visibility was perhaps 30 feet. She could not see the barn. He went out twice that morning to tend the animals, returning with the cold coming off him like weather of his own, ice in his hair and on his collar, and she had coffee waiting both times, without making anything of it because she simply noted when he left and had it ready when he came back. He drank it standing at the stove, not sitting, as though sitting would be admitting to something he was not prepared to admit. He was not an easy man to read. That was not unusual in the men she dealt with, ranchers and farmers and the husbands of women in labor, the kind of men who had learned to keep themselves close to themselves because the work demanded it and the land demanded it and nobody had particularly asked them to open up. She knew how to move around that kind of reserve. You did not push at it. You simply occupied the same space with patience and let people find their own way to comfort. By midday she had made biscuits, which he ate 4 of, with no comment, and then said quietly and without elaboration, "Those are good, my mother's recipe," she said. She was a cook before she was anything else. He looked at her. Before she was what? Cassia considered this. A wife. A midwife herself for a while, before she had me. She paused. "She's the one who taught me the work." She said it was the most important thing a woman could do in a place like this. Be there when a baby came, because nobody else was going to be. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "She's right about that," he said. The afternoon passed in a comfortable alternation of tasks. She mended a tear in her coat that she had been ignoring for a month. He worked at the ledger desk for a while and then came out and repaired a hinge on one of the kitchen cupboards that had been loose and was now not. She did not point out that she had noticed the hinge. He did not mention that he had noticed. Her noticing some things communicate clearly without speech. In the evening she asked him about the ranch, and he told her about it with the careful precision of a man who liked his subject. He had bought it with the money left from his first homestead in Nebraska, which had been good farmland, but flat and featureless in a way that had slowly worn at him. He had wanted hills. He had wanted the particular quality of light that Wyoming had in the fall, the long gold light that came sideways across the grass. He had found it here, he said. The hills were right, and the light was right, and the grass grew thick in the summer along the creek. He had 40 cattle going into this winter, down from 52 when he bought the place. The loss years were part of ranching. You built back. He told her about the cattle with more warmth than he had told her almost anything else, and she listened with genuine interest, because she had always found that people told you the most about themselves when they talked about the things they loved, not the things they had done. "You came here alone," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. She did not ask about the photograph on the shelf. On the third morning, the snow had lightened to a steady fall rather than a driving storm, but the accumulation was deep enough now that the yard was buried past the bottom rail of the paddock fence, and the road north was invisible. He went out to check on the cattle in the far pasture, and came back 3 hours later than she expected, and she had supper started by the time he arrived. He came through the door with something different in his face. Not worry exactly. Something more contained than that. 2 cows got out of the east field, he said. Fence line went down under the snow weight. I found them and got them back, but the fence still needs work when this lets up. She handed him coffee. He took it. "You could have used another pair of hands," she said. "You're not a ranch hand," he said, not dismissively, just accurately. "No, but I can follow instructions and I'm not afraid of cold." She looked at him steadily. "Tomorrow, if the snow eases, take me with you." He looked at her for a moment with that gray-green gaze, and she watched him run through the objections and discard them one by one, because she was right that an extra pair of hands helped and wrong was wrong. "All right," he said. They worked together the next morning, which was still cold but calmer. The wind dropped, and the snowfall intermittent rather than constant. He showed her what to do with the fence wire, and she did it without complaint and without fuss, her fingers going numb and her coat not quite adequate for the work, but her will. She had never done this before, but she was observant, and she followed his hands closely, and she made no errors. The cattle watched them from the other side of the repaired line with the profound bovine disinterest of animals that have made their peace with winter. Walking back to the house, she slipped on a patch of ice under the fresh snow and went sideways, and he caught her arm without thinking, one quick grip that held her until she found her footing. He let go immediately. "Thank you," she said. "Careful," he said. But something had changed slightly in the way he stood beside her. After that, not dramatic. Just a small adjustment in the way he held his body when she was near, the way he had of standing when he was paying attention to something. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, filed it away and said nothing. By the end of the first week, the roads were still impossible, and the snow kept falling, not always hard but constant, the way Wyoming winter sometimes decided to be. Patient and relentless and uninterested in human timelines. She sent word with a ranch hand from the neighboring Dole's Spread, who made it through on horseback heading for town, asking him to get word to her clients that she was stormbound at the Hale ranch, and then she settled into the days as they were. She learned the shape of his life through living beside it. He rose before dawn and checked the animals, and came in for coffee and a meal and then went back out. He did not talk much in the mornings, and she learned to match that rhythm, to be present without demanding anything, to offer the coffee and the silence, and let him come to speech in his own time. By the third week, she had stopped thinking of it as accommodation, and started thinking of it as simply a fact about mornings, the way some people needed quiet, and some people needed company, and most people needed a little of both. He came to words more easily in the evenings. After supper, when the work was done, and the house was warm, and the storm did whatever it did outside without requiring anything of either of them, he would sometimes sit at the table and talk. He told her about Nebraska. He told her about the brother he had who ran a feed store in Kansas City, and who was the more naturally sociable of the two of them, which was saying something, he acknowledged, without quite smiling. He told her about the first winter in Wyoming when the cattle had come through better than expected, and he had understood for the first time that he had chosen correctly, that this was the place, that whatever came next would happen here. She told him things, too. She told him about her mother's house in Ohio and the smell of it in winter, damp wood and candle wax, and the particular sharpness of the herbs her mother dried above the kitchen window. She told him about the first birth she had attended alone before she was licensed when she was 19, and the nearest real midwife was 12 miles away in a storm, very like this one, and a woman she barely knew had needed her. She told him about the journal she kept, the record of every birth, the names she remembered, the way a name carried the whole weight of a person who had not been in the world before and now was. He listened to her with the same attention he gave to everything, the fence line, the cattle in the far pasture, the sky before a storm, the specific gravity of a person who had learned, through long experience, that most things reward careful observation. One evening she came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth, and found him standing at the shelf above the window, looking at the small photograph. He heard her come in and did not turn around immediately, and she gave him a moment. When he turned, he was composed. "My wife," he said, "Eleanor. She died 3 years ago. Fever. Very fast." "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it simply, without elaboration. "She would have liked you," he said. Not as a compliment, exactly. More as an observation. She was practical. She didn't make a fuss. Cassia looked at the photograph, a young woman with light-colored hair and a direct expression, wearing a high-collared dress, standing in front of what looked like a younger version of the same barn she had sheltered in on the first night. "She looks like she knew what she was doing," Cassia said. "She always did," he said. They stood in the quiet of the room for a moment, both looking at the photograph, the wind outside going steadily at its own business. "You've been managing a long time alone," she said. Not a question this time, either. "Yes," he said. He sat down at the table and she sat across from him, and he poured 2 cups of something warm, and they stayed there, in the particular companionship of the evening, until the fire needed tending. The storm lifted in early January, a cold, brilliant morning of hard sun on clean snow, and the road to Ridgecrest was open enough that she could have left. She thought about it clearly, sitting at the kitchen window with her coffee. She had a birth coming up in Whitmore in about 10 days. She could make it if she left today or tomorrow. She thought about the Whitmore family. She thought about the road, 30 miles of frozen track, with a loaded wagon on uncertain footing. She thought about the cold, which had, if anything, intensified now that the cloud cover was gone, a dry, bitter cold that dropped to 20 below at night and sat at single digits through the day. She thought about the fact that Garrick had cracked the ice in the water trough 3 times yesterday morning and had not said anything about it, the way he did not say anything about most of what the ranch required of him, simply absorbed it and moved to the next thing. She went out and helped with the ice. She stayed. This was not a dramatic decision. It was a series of small ones that accumulated into a pattern, the way most of life's actual choices worked. Not a moment of thunder and lightning, but a quiet accumulation of days in which leaving stopped feeling necessary and then stopped feeling like the natural next thing and then stopped feeling like the question she was asking at all. She wrote to her clients with revised timelines. She wrote to Mrs. Callie Prout in Whitmore and told her she was storm-bound but coming, that she would be there well before the birth was due, and she would be, because she kept her word. She wrote to a younger midwife in Ridgecrest, Dina Holt, and asked her to cover the circuit in the meantime, which Dina was more than capable of doing. She arranged what needed, arranging with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and then she turned her attention to the life that was actually in front of her. The ranch in deep winter had a character she had not expected. There was a beauty to it, ruthless and enormous, the kind of beauty that did not care about you, but that you could observe from a position of warmth and appreciate for what it was. The hills to the north were white and tremendous under the blue sky. The creek below the east pasture was frozen solid, and the ice caught the light in the mornings and threw it back in colors she did not have names for. The cattle moved through the snow in slow, deliberate patterns, their breath rising in clouds, patient and unsentimental. She learned more about cattle than she had expected to learn. She learned about the way they behaved before weather, the particular nervousness that meant a storm was coming. She learned how to check a leg for lameness, because Garrick showed her one afternoon with the matter-of-fact patience of a man who did not assume she could not learn something new. She learned to read the pasture conditions from the kitchen window before putting on her coat, because there was a difference between conditions that required full gear and conditions that were merely cold. He learned things about her, too, though it was harder to observe, because he was quieter about it. She noticed it in the way he adjusted slightly, the small accommodations of two people learning to share a space, the way he started leaving the coffee on the stove at an hour she was more likely to be up than he was, the way he moved the lamp to the table in the evenings when she was reading rather than waiting for her to ask for better light. One afternoon in January she was working at the table on a letter to a colleague in Denver, writing about a difficult presentation she had managed the previous fall, the kind of letter that was really about working through the case in her own mind, as much as it was about the colleague. Garrick came in from outside and went through to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her and looked at what she was writing without reading it and said, "Problem case. Difficult presentation," she said. "I managed it, but I want to write it through to understand why it went the way it did." He nodded, like going back over the fence line after a breach. He said, looking for the point it started. She looked at him. "Exactly like that," she said. He sat down at the other end of the table with his coffee and his own ledger work, and they were quiet together for the rest of the afternoon, in a way that was deeply and unremarkably comfortable, the way long-established people are comfortable, as though they had been doing this for years rather than weeks. She noticed the thought and set it down without examining it directly. In the 3rd week of January, one of the cattle was in trouble. He came in from the morning check, earlier than usual, and she knew from the pace of his steps that something was wrong before she saw his face. "Heifer," he said, presenting wrong. Cassia put her coat on without being asked. She was already thinking through what she knew, which was more than he might have expected. She had attended difficult livestock births before, not often, but enough, and the mechanics were not entirely unlike her own work. The principles of helping a laboring creature were the same whether the creature was a woman in a farmhouse or a young cow in a frozen field. You assessed the situation. You did not panic. You used what you knew and adapted what you did not. They worked together for 2 hours in the cold of the barn, and it was hard and frightening in the way that birth crises always were, that narrow space between one outcome and the other. But she had steady hands, and she had been in that space before, and she knew how to be calm inside it, and when it was done, a live calf, gawky and indignant, already trying to stand, she sat back on her heels in the straw and looked at the animal and felt the particular exhaustion and satisfaction Garrick was beside her, and he was looking at the calf, and there was something in his face that was stripped back from its usual composure, not grief, something simpler. He was a man who had lost things and spent a long time learning to expect loss. And this was not loss, and the face of a person surprised by that was quite distinct. "That was good work," he said. "The heifer did most of it," she said. He looked at her. "You know what I mean?" "Yes," she said. They stayed in the barn until they were sure the calf was nursing, and then they went inside and she made eggs and he ate them, and neither of them spoke very much, because there are kinds of mornings that do not need embellishment. Later that evening, after supper, he was at the table and she was mending. She had taken to mending things around the house, the practical repairs that accumulated when a person lived alone and did not tend to them, not because anyone asked her, but because idle hands did not suit her. A shirt of his that had a tear at the collar, a kitchen cloth with a frayed edge. He looked up from the ledger and watched her hands for a moment. "You are not a woman who sits still," he said. "You did." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to ask you something without it coming out wrong." She looked up from the mending. "Ask it," she said. "I won't take it wrong. You have a life, your work, your circuit. You had that before you came here, and you'll have it when you leave." "Yes," she said. "Do you miss it?" It was not the question she had been waiting for, and it landed with a particular honesty that she respected. She considered it genuinely, because he deserved a genuine answer. "I don't miss being on the road alone. Those are two different things." She paused. "And I've found things to do with my hands here that need doing, so the restlessness is managed." She held up the shirt with the mended collar. "This has been sitting in a basket for 6 months. He looked at the shirt. Something moved across his face that he did not entirely manage to set aside. "Eleanor used to mend things," he said. "I stopped taking them out of the basket after." The room was quiet. "I didn't mean to," she began. "No," he said. "It's all right." He was looking at the shirt, and his face was measured, but present. "It's a good thing. I know it's a good thing." She laid the shirt on the table, and he picked it up and looked at it for a moment and then set it down again. "She would have wanted the shirt mended," he said. "She was not a woman who tolerated things sitting in baskets." "Neither am I," Cassia said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the nearest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably. "No," he said. "I noticed that." February came in with a brief thaw that lasted 4 days, and raised impossible hopes and then retreated back to cold again, as Wyoming winters reliably did. In the 4 days of thaw, she could have made it to Ridgecrest. She had deliveries coming in late February and early March, and she needed to be back on her circuit before then. She was going to have to leave soon, regardless, and she knew it, and the knowing had begun to sit differently than she had expected. She had thought about this with the same clear-eyed attention she brought to everything. She was 28 years old. She had been on the road for 3 years. She loved her work with a genuine and uncomplicated love. The weight of it, the importance of it, the specific way it made her feel when she came through. For someone who had needed her, she was not a woman who had been waiting to settle. She had not been dreaming of permanence. She had not come to Garrick Hale's ranch looking for anything except shelter from a storm. And yet, she had learned to read his quiet, the specific silence that meant he was thinking something he was not yet ready to say, distinguished from the silence that meant he was simply thinking, distinguished from the silence that was just the comfortable nothing of 2 people in the same warm room. She had learned which cattle were which, and where the fence lines ran, and what the sky looked like before a storm from the kitchen window. She had learned that he made better biscuits than her when he decided to try, which he had proven once on a Sunday morning as a kind of quiet, competitive statement that she had noted and privately respected. He had learned the way she organized a kitchen, which was different from how he organized a kitchen, and he had adapted without complaint. He had learned that she read in the evenings and did not want conversation then and could be talked to later, after the book was down, and that this was not indifference, but simply the way she worked. He had learned that she was not afraid of hard work, but that she was exacting about it, that she would not do a thing halfway, and that if she said she would do something, it was done. On a Wednesday afternoon in late February, she was standing at the kitchen window, watching the pasture in the last of the light, and he came in behind her, and stood at a distance that was neither near nor far, and she heard him and did not turn around immediately. "The road will clear in a few days," he said. "Yes," she said, "your circuit, your work. You'll want to get back." She considered the window. The long gold light that he had come to Wyoming for was there, doing what he had described, coming in sideways across the hills, finding everything, making the snow look like something worth looking at. "I have 2 births in March," she said. "I need to be in Whitmore by the 21st. That gives you 2 weeks to get to Ridgecrest and pick up your schedule." "It does." She turned then. He was standing by the table with his hands at his sides, which was how he stood when he had made up his mind to say something and had not quite said it yet. "Garrick, I'm not asking you to give up your work," he said. "I want to be plain about that. All right, I know what your work is. I know what it means. I watched you in that barn, and I've watched you every day since you got here, and you are not a woman who could live without it. I'm not asking you to." She waited. "But I am asking," he said, "whether the circuit couldn't run from here as well as from Ridgecrest. Whether a woman who rode from ranch to ranch across 2 counties couldn't do that with a home base that happened to be a working ranch 30 miles from town." He stopped. "Whether you might want that." The light through the window was the long gold kind, the specific kind that had brought him here, and that she had been watching for 2 months, without quite acknowledging that she had been watching it on purpose. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He met her eyes. "I'm asking whether you might want to," he said. "Whether you want a home that has you in it when you're not on the road. Whether you might want—" He stopped. "Whether you might want me." Cassia stood in the kitchen of the house where she had spent the winter, and looked at this man who had let her in out of a storm, and fed her, and worked beside her, and talked to her in the evenings, and learned her rhythms without being asked, and had not once tried to make her smaller than she was. She said yes, not quickly and not slowly, simply with the directness of a woman who knew her own mind and had the good sense to say what was true. He let out a breath she had not heard him hold, and crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his, the way a person holds something they have been afraid of losing before they had a right to call it theirs. Spring came to the Hale ranch in the slow, incremental way. Wyoming spring always came, not a single clean morning, but a long argument between winter and the sun, that the sun eventually won. The creek broke up in mid-March, a sound that carried to the house, a great cracking and settling that she heard from the barn where she was attending to Josephine, and she stood and listened to it with a feeling in her chest that she did not try to name. She had been back on her circuit for 3 weeks by then, picking up where she had left off, making the rounds in the reorganized schedule that worked from the Hale ranch as its base point rather than from Ridgecrest. It was logistically simpler than she had expected. Ridgecrest was 30 miles south, which was a day's ride, and her clients were distributed across the territory in a wide arc that could be reached from here nearly as well as from there. She had kept the rented room in Ridgecrest for the night she needed to stay over in town, but the room was rented less often now. The 2 March births had gone well. A boy in Whitmore for the Prout family who had been waiting with considerable anxiety, and a girl at the Sanderson homestead 12 miles to the east, a 4th child who arrived with the efficiency of an experienced baby and gave everyone a great deal less trouble than the previous 3. She came home from each of them tired and satisfied in the deep, uncomplicated way that good work produced, and she rode into the Hale yard in the late light and stabled Josephine and went inside, and he was there, or he was not yet back from whatever the ranch needed, but the house was warm, and there was food, or the makings of it, and it was hers. The way the open road was also hers. She had not expected to find that these 2 things were compatible. She had held them in her mind as opposites for so long, the road and the house, the freedom of movement and the permanence of a place, that discovering they were not opposites, but simply different modes of the same life, was something she was still adjusting to. They were married in April at the Ridgecrest Church, a plain service with the minister and 2 witnesses, Dina Holt and the rancher from the neighboring Dole's spread. She wore a good dress she had made herself over the winter, a deep blue-gray wool that was practical enough for daily wear and fine enough for a wedding, which was the combination she had been aiming for. He wore his best coat and had shaved the night before and was, she observed privately, a considerably handsome man when he had gotten enough sleep. He put the ring on her finger and she put the ring on his, and they looked at each other in the clean morning light of the little church, with the easy directness of 2 people who had been seeing each other clearly for months. They drove home in the wagon, in the April sun, the road soft with thaw, and the hills beginning to show green under the snow's retreat. And she had her hand on the bench between them, and he took it and kept it, driving one-handed, and neither of them felt the need to say anything about it. The summer on the Hale ranch was the kind of thing she had not entirely known to want. Long days of work, honest and necessary. The garden she put in along the south wall of the house. The cattle work she understood better. Now the way the ranch had a rhythm that matched itself to the seasons, with a rightness she found deeply satisfying. She was on her circuit for a week or 2 at a time, returning with the particular tiredness of good work, and the house was always warm, and he was always there, and the garden grew. He let her make changes to the house over time, the small ones that accumulated into a life. She brought herbs from the Ridgecrest market and hung them above the kitchen window, where she had noticed the light fell well for drying. She brought a second lamp for the evening reading, the better light she had been managing without. She brought a desk for the front room, a writing table where she could work on the journal, and the correspondence that her practice required, because a midwife was also a record keeper and a community figure, and those things needed their own space. He watched her make the house into something shared and said nothing. But one afternoon she came in from the barn and found a new shelf above the writing desk, solid and well-made, sized exactly for the kind of books and materials she kept. She stood and looked at it for a moment. He was in the kitchen. The old shelf was too narrow, he said without looking up. She said, "The new one is exactly the right width." He said, "Yes." She set her first journal on it, the worn one that had all the births from her first year, and it sat there on his shelf in her house, and looked the way things looked when they were in the right place. The photograph of Eleanor remained above the kitchen window. She had not asked him to move it, and he had not offered to, and it stayed where it was. Eleanor was part of the ranch, the way the hills to the north were part of the ranch, part of what this place had been before she came to it. she found that she did not mind this. The ranch had a history that was not hers, and the man she had married had a grief that was not hers either, and these were not problems to be solved, but things to be known and honored. He did not stop grieving Eleanor. But grief was not the same as longing, and he was not lost. She saw that clearly. He was a man who had come through something terrible, and built carefully back from it, and was now building again, differently, with her, a choice made fully, not a settling for whatever was available. She felt that intention every day, and it made her steady. It was October when the Tenney girl arrived at the Hale ranch, the daughter of the Tenney family she had been at when the storm first caught her, young Bertha Tenney, grown heavier and slower and very tired, unable to make it to town and unwilling to wait for a midwife to come the full distance. And, the Hale ranch being the nearest house where she knew she would find one, Cassia put Bertha in the bedroom, in the bed she slept in, on sheets that had been changed that morning, and she worked with the efficiency and quiet competence of a woman who had been doing this for years, which she had. Garrick stoked a stove and kept the house warm and brought water when she called for it, and went outside when the hours grew long, and she needed him out from underfoot, without being asked, understanding instinctively the geography of a birth. The baby came at 2 in the morning, a small, perfect girl, and Cassia laid her on Bertha's chest, and the young woman's face broke open in that ancient and specific way that faces broke open in that moment, and Cassia stood back and watched it and felt what she always felt, which was something that had no single clean name, but was made of gratitude and gravity and the specific privilege of being the person in the room. She came out to the main room at 4 in the morning, her sleeves rolled up, her hair come loose, and he was at the table with a lantern and a cup of cold coffee, and he looked at her face and knew. He set the coffee down and looked at her with the full attention that was one of the things she had married him for, among others. "Good," he said. She sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. This was the part she had always done alone before the coming down part, the return from the intensity of the work to the ordinary world. She had done it in her wagon on dark roads and in borrowed beds in strangers' houses and in the rented room in Ridgecrest. Doing it here, in this room, with him across from her in the lantern light, was different. Not softer, exactly, just accompanied. He got up and poured the cold coffee out and made fresh, and set it in front of her, and sat back down and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she drank the coffee and let the night settle around them both. "Go to sleep," she said eventually. "When you do," he said. She looked at him, he looked back, steady and unhurried, not going anywhere. "Garrick! Cassia!" he said. "No," he said. "But you knew that I did," she said. She drank the last of the coffee and stood up, and he stood with her, and they walked down the hall together in the dark house. Bertha Tenney and her new daughter, asleep in the bedroom, and the lantern burning low in the main room behind them. She said nothing more that night, and neither did he. None was needed. The house held its warmth around them, not waiting for anyone, not asking anything of either of them except that they be there, which they were, and which they intended to stay. By the time the second winter came, her winter, the winter she had not stumbled into but arrived for, provisioned and ready, the ranch had changed enough that visitors remarked on it without being able to say exactly what was different. The yard was the same, the barn was the same, the low-slung house, with smoke from the chimney, was the same. But there was a quality to the place, a feeling you got from the lit windows at evening, a sense that the house was inhabited by people who had made a decision about it, that set it apart from the places that were merely occupied. Her desk was in the front room, with the journals on his shelf above it, herbs dried above the kitchen window. The garden along the south wall had been put to bed for winter, and would come back in the spring. The photograph of Eleanor was where it had always been, and the late light found it in the afternoons the way it always had, warm and still. She was on her circuit less in the winter. The roads made it impractical, and she had organized her clients toward the spring and fall travel seasons as much as birth allowed. In the winter she was mostly here, doing the work that a midwife did in the between times: letters, records, the continuing education that the good ones pursued, correspondence with colleagues in Denver and Cheyenne, and the ranch work, which was now also her work, genuinely and not provisionally. He came in one December evening from the far pasture check, stomping snow from his boots, and she was at the desk, and she turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was nothing to say that required saying, because everything that needed to be known was apparent from the way two people who had built something together looked at each other at the end of a long day. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at the corner of her desk. She said, "How are the cattle?" "Fine," he said. "The east fence is holding good," she said. He sat down at the table with his ledger, and she turned back to her letter, and they were quiet together, in the lamplight the way they were quiet, not in the absence of things to say, but in the presence of a comfort that did not require them. Outside, the storm that had been building since noon finally arrived, pressing at the shutters and driving snow along the ground in long white curtains. Inside, the stove worked its steady work. The ranch sat in the storm and made nothing of it, because it had seen worse, and it was standing, and the people inside it were staying. She had come in out of a blizzard 13 months ago, a traveling woman with a satchel and nowhere particular to stop. She had not planned this. She had not looked for it. She had been practical and observant, and willing to be changed by what she found, and what she found had been this: a house that needed someone to inhabit it fully, a man who had been living carefully inside his own grief. She had stayed till the storm broke, and then, because there was nothing else she would have wanted instead, she had simply stayed. If this story moved you, please leave a like and subscribe to keep up with more. There are more stories to tell. Stories of ordinary people on the frontier who found each other in the hard seasons and held on. We will keep bringing them to you, as long as you keep watching.